lot of times on a shortboard, you're waving your arms a lot to get the board to move. And it looks like you're throwing pizzas and rolling up the windows. And mid-lengths, you don't have to lift it up and tic-tac. It's already a byproduct. It's already calming your body instead of rushing things. The longer I'm on that rail or the longer I'm flat on the board in a really sweet part of the wave, I'm in trim and I'm getting maximum speed. You're just going to stay committed to that rail. And it takes a lot of faith. You know, you have to get to know your rail line and believe in the board that it will do that. And if you have a good board, they should be designed to do that. One way to keep your balance and to keep your form and poise is to use your front hand. And you're not staring at your fingertips. You're gazing past your fingertips, but it's sort of like the sight of a rifle. You're looking and using this, where am I going?
Welcome to the Basis Surf Podcast. Super excited. We got Devon Howard today, who's really been at the forefront of pushing mid-lengths into kind of the forefront of surfing awareness. He's somebody that's been developing mid-lengths for many years, was one of the first people I actually saw riding mid-length way back when. And it's crazy how much mid-lengths have really taken over. And so many surfers swear by them and are obsessed with them. And so I figured we'd go straight to the source and get all the insights on how to ride a mid-length better, thinking about style, how to pick the right mid-length. So this is going to be a really action-packed discussion. But thanks for joining us, Devon.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, let's just dive right in. How do we surf as good as you do on a mid-length? Just give us all the secrets so we can we have that kind of smooth style and just rip those beautiful turns. What are the secrets?
Well, I think if you follow that guy Raglan Surf Report, who's a pretty funny guy, I'm pretty sure he sums it up. You just sort of stand there and do nothing, right? Just stand there. It's
well, that is the beginning of it all, though, right?
It is, yeah. It is kind of, well, like anything, there's, what is it, the 10,000 hours, whatever it is. So my background goes back to longboard surfing since I was a teenager. So I'm comfortable with a longer rail. I'm just and lower rocker. That's just where I came from. So the transition from being a longboarder, logger, high performance, I've done it all the different things you can do on a longboard. Jumping on the mid-length was a much more natural or easier transition than jumping all the way to a performance shortboard. I did grow up riding performance shortboards when I was 14. I switched to longboards. And then I didn't get really into what we call them eggs. People call it, the category now is called mid-length, which, just for the listeners, is really a catch-all term. It's sort of this in-between zone. And within the mid-length sort of category, there's lots of different designs. So I'd say the one world I come from is more what we call an egg. Now that's not a very sexy name for some people. It sounds kind of weird and dorky, but the egg goes back to the late 60s. Skip Fry developed it. And then it sort of stuck around in the 70s and on through the 80s. And then later on, it became sort of bastardized. The design was changed a little bit and was known as a fun board. So you may, if you're new to surfing, you might have seen that term out there. And fun board was really a sort of a derogatory description of the board. It was the same way that many of us may view a wave storm or like the big soft tops, the Jerry Lopez or whatever. Those boards had that stigma for a long time. However, there was still kind of an underground group of people riding eggs and various boards that now you could call them mid-lengths. But it wasn't a mainstream thing. It just wasn't super popular. And I think, I want to say it was late 90s. I was riding for Donald Takayama as a team rider, as a longboarder. And Joel Tudor was already for years had Donald making him some mid-length type boards or eggs that were inspired by Wayne Lynch. And clearly that caught my eye. I thought that looked pretty cool. And Donald suggested, hey, try one of these eggs I got. It was a 7.6. And it was just like this door opened in my life. I didn't know it was, I was like, this speaks to me more than longboarding even. It was like the perfect mix between which I love shortboarding. I suck at it, but I like it. And I grew up uh, absorbing the culture and all that went with it, the magazines, the movies, the competitions. I grew up in the 80s, and I idolized Tom Curran and anybody with like a clean style. So this egg was like taking those things I just described that I loved and all the cool things I loved about longboarding. And it was like kind of right there in this intersection in the middle. And I was always into sort of fringe stuff, which is why I longboarded in the first place. There was really almost no 14-year-olds longboarding. You'd see a handful in your city. Like, wow, hey, you longboard too? No way. You're a weirdo as well? Nice.
Yeah.
And that's what the mid-length thing. And then stuck with it for decades. And then you fast forward all the way to the last 5 years was connecting with Channel Islands. And then maybe that's when you might have come across some of the surfing, or I don't know, or maybe you did before that. And I mean, we could go on for a while, but back to your original question. Sorry, I kind of took a detour there.
Actually, can I ask you a question
sure.
before we even get into the technique? Because we're definitely going to get into it. I mean, I remember, I don't even know how long ago, maybe 8-10 years ago or something. I saw it was on Vimeo when there's lots of surf content on Vimeo, and I remember you riding an egg, and no one else was riding. I didn't see anybody else riding, eggs, and I just remember looking at that and being like, "Whoa, what is he riding? Look at those lines that he's doing," and then gradually, the mid-length the egg became more and more popular. And I'm curious, like, what do you think drove that shift? Was it just, you and a couple guys, the tutors and whatnot, and then everybody else is just seeing you probably catch waves way out the back further than them, and then getting jealous because you're getting all the best waves and being like, I need that secret weapon too? Or like, what do you think drove that?
That's an interesting question. I think there's no short answer. There's a couple quick things that I think all came together. So social media and YouTube and Vimeo, when you saw that video, was a bit more popular. I feel like it's kind of taken the backseat to YouTube, obviously.
Yeah.
So I think, so now with those things, you don't have the surf media as a filter. You used to have your surf media was coming to you through print media and through a couple websites. And that type of surfing was not at all interesting to those editorial teams, which we don't even need to get into that. It's pretty well known. That's
right,
fine.
Right.
But the social media, YouTube and all that sort of, it bypassed those gatekeepers.
Yeah.
And so, and I always knew, and from having conversations with lots of people, Takayama, Joel, Joel was onto this stuff before I was, of course, but we were in the same sort of circles. Our belief was always like, look, there's way more people that would identify with this and appreciate it. It makes it's more approachable. It makes more sense. But you can only get it out word of mouth. So I think that's the first piece of it. It's just connecting to people through the social / YouTube world. And then the other thing was a couple, like a superstar or two that came in. I appreciate you giving me credit being part of it, which I feel part of it. But I think I would say Torrin Martin is probably the biggest influence in the last 5-6 years. And Torrin grew up as a shortboarder. I don't know his whole story. He probably was doing QS stuff. Phenomenal surfer, and then connects with Simon Jones, I think, and he's riding his version of a mid-length, which is I would call it a really pulled-in egg, like we would almost call it a speed egg, which is kind of a funny terminology. But in San Diego, where I grew up, that board, you'd say, oh, that's a speed egg. And so, and he did these incredible films and was drawing maybe, I wouldn't say the same lines, but let's say with the similar lines. But what Torrin had that I didn't was this ability to tube ride and push that kind of surfing in real waves of consequence.
Yeah.
I've got a day job and married and family. I don't, no excuses. I don't get out and adventure. I'd love to surf waves like that. So when I saw this guy, that was inspiring to me. I was watching what he was doing going, yes, see, I always believed and I know you can ride those boards in those kinds of waves. Now, do most people want to do that? No, but it catches your eye.
Right.
And the lines he draws out on the face are what capture people. go look at any Torrin Martin video, and the views, if you care about this stuff, that tells you what the audience is. Some of his videos have like 1 million+ views, and that's insane for a guy that's kind of cruising.
Yeah.
So that's the second part, I'd say, Torrin Martin. And then sort of coming in around the same time was Mikey February jumping on a mid-length. Now,
Right.
we know and love Mikey. He can ride anything, and he's very adaptable. I think every decade there's only one or two surfers like a Mikey February. 2 decades ago, it was David Rostovich. Before that, it was, I guess, Tom Curran or Kelly or whoever. And so Mikey's lines are a little bit of everything, a little bit of Torrin, maybe a little bit of the stuff I do, but he's got more flair and he's doing it with a lot of speed and commitment on the rail at J-Bay. So again, now bypassing the gatekeepers, this stuff is just getting out there and it just kind of goes viral on its own. So I think the answer to your question was a couple little things happened, and the people were already there. They just didn't know that this is the kind of surfing they wanted to do. They didn't know that this makes a lot of sense. I don't want a longboard because it's big and bulky. It's really difficult. If I'm in New Jersey pushing through, jumpy waves, that's really a lot of board to handle. But oh wait, I get the 610. It's a little hard to duck dive, but we could talk about duck diving if you'd like. There's a technique to getting through the lineup, and it's more manageable. And then they're not on a 6.0 potato chip and struggling, because the reality is they either don't have the fitness or the water time.
Yeah.
Maybe they started surfing a bit late, and it's just not realistic. And the goal for all of us is to have a good time, and is not to suffer.
Hey everyone, my name is Van, and I'm an everyday surfer that's just obsessed with improving. And I wanted to take everything that I've learned, everything that I've struggled with, all the mistakes that I've learned along the way, and share it with you to help you become the best surfer that you can be. And I'm super lucky on this podcast. I get to interview the world's top pros, shapers, coaches, and take you along on my journey as I try to learn, uncover all the gold so you can apply to your own surfing. So hopefully you're going to get some value out of this. And the best way you can support me is just simply by sharing this podcast with whoever else you think may benefit from it. I also have been working really hard for a long time on something that I think is going to help a ton of people. I know that it was a game changer for myself as well. More to come on that over the next coming months. I'm super excited. Thank you for all the support. And for those of you just joining for the first time, welcome to the Basis community. Super stoked to have you. Right. Yeah. And definitely the mid-length can help you suffer a lot less. I mean, that's what I pull out when it's, barreling hard over here in the Northeast, because it just makes things so much easier. Obviously, there are certain days when the pier is too short and you just can't make it out. But,
Sure.
when it's tubing, it's so much easier to get in early with a longer board and all that planing surface and all of that. So it's been a godsend for me personally, when it's barreling really hard. So let's get into, your approach to riding mid-length, because I feel like it does make surfing a lot more approachable. And I feel like it's a great way to learn how to do turns and generate speed. It forces good technique in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, what are your thoughts? Maybe we could start even with just the basics of generating speed.
Sure. Well, you're usually coming at it from one angle or the other. So one angle is you're sort of coming up to it. You're sizing up from a short board. So there's that perspective. And then there's the long board and you're sizing down. So, and there's kind of different approaches depending where you're coming from. So let's start with shortboard. So shortboards have a very short rail, obviously, and they typically have a lot more rocker, and they often have a little bit more going on in the bottom with concaves. Not all, but most of those boards work and are propelled forward through a pumping action, where you're really lifting the board out of the water. You're lifting and you're tic-tacking back and forth. And at the same time, you're on sort of almost like a ball bearing, but you're sort of like lifting up and you're on this gyro. And especially if you have a short board with a single concave entry, you can't just stand up point to the channel or wherever and cruise. It just doesn't work. You're going to bog. Um, However, if you watch everyone around you, you pick it up, you figure out how to pump. Oh, whoa! Now I'm flying. Now I have some speed, and then you can get into the talk about maneuvers. But so knowing that that's happening as a shortboarder, when you get onto a mid length, it is so hard to resist doing this. You have to the first few waves do nothing at all. Kind of how we jokingly started off this conversation.
Yeah.
Is total reset. Uh,
Mm.
just get up and aim for the shoulder and just sort of like feel it. And you're like, okay, oh, well, this thing trims really quite easily on its own without doing anything. All right. Okay. And then a couple more waves. Now start leaning on your inside rail of your front side and just feeling this rail, because what the big difference is shortboarding is tail surfing. You're riding off the tail and the fins mostly. Mid-length surfing is rail surfing. And I think when you can really understand that, it allows you to sort of settle into it and not fight it. Uh, I work at Channel Islands. I've been here for about 5 years. We're known for performance shortboards. We have a lot of world-class shortboard surfers here. And when they've gotten on the mid-length without any instruction, without me saying a word, they didn't always, it wasn't like an immediate falling in love. It was like, this is kind of frustrating. And watching them ride it without saying anything, they were over surfing the board. So they
Mm.
were trying to tic tac back and forth. So when you can kind of see my hand here on the screen. Now, if I do that on a mid length, I'm breaking trim. It's almost like a mini stall in a way.
Yep.
Now, there are some mid lengths. I don't even need to say the brands. There are mid lengths out there with way more rocker than the ones that I like to ride. Now, those are more of a shortboard rocker. You probably could pump them, but it's going to look a little awkward, and it's a lot of work. It's a lot of board to pump back and forth. It's sort of like riding a giant, Sector 9 board in a pool or on a ramp. It's like you can do it, but it looks like they're kind of struggling, like really having to work for it. So most mids, eggs, whatever you're riding, even if it's a fish shape, they're usually lower rocker. And you don't want to pick the board up back and forth. Instead, what you want to do is you want to find a rhythm where you're going back and forth from the rail. So it's more if you get on this ball bearing kind of thing and you're on one rail. So I put, 3/4 of the rail in the water on a bottom turn, then I start climbing up the face. And then I lean back to the other side, and it becomes this different type of pumping. The board is attached to the wave. I'm not lifting it out of the water.
Yeah.
And I'm going in this back and forth rhythm. And the rhythm works when you put the board in the right part of the wave. So it's difficult to do if you're way ahead of the section. You're going to struggle, and you're just like any board, you're not going to do very well out there. So you want to be a bit in the pocket, take off a little bit deeper. Let's say you see a wave coming, almost like you're backdooring a section. You're not, obviously the wave's not tubing if it's just playful. And when you get to your feet, maybe angle the board a little bit. Maybe don't go straight to the beach, because it is a lot of board, and because it's lower rocker, it may not fit in the curve of the wave initially. So my advice on when you're starting off riding these types of boards is to paddle in on a 45-degree angle, which I think most any surf instructor would tell you to do that with most any board. But it's especially true with these, because if the wave pitches up and you're coming, especially we're still talking about people coming from the short board, it's going to really catch you off guard having that extra foot out in front of you, and it's lower. So to fit in that curve, go on a 45, go down and aim to the trough of the wave, and now kind of get in like a snowboard mode. Not in a park, but if you've ever watched snowboarding, powder, those guys and gals that do the giant carves, that's sort of what the mid length is. You're doing this long rail surfing. You're engaging one rail. So off the bottom turn, I'm all this rails in, 3/4 of it at least. I like to go to 5/6. I like just a little bit out. And then as I'm coming up, now the board has contact with the face and it's more or less like straight, like right on the face.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go up, and instead of going up the face of the wave like a short board, you're in this attack mode of, I'm going to aim for 12 o'clock. The reality is most people only go to 9 or 10, but in your mind, you're like, I'm going to 12 o'clock.
Right.
You don't want to do that on the mid length. You intentionally want to aim for 9 o'clock on the mid length. So you just change the trajectory of where you're going up the face. You can go 12 o'clock on a mid length if you're really good. But again, it goes back to that example of this giant skateboard in a pool. It just gets really cumbersome. But the board wants to go to 9 o'clock. It's very comfortable there. And then when you get to 9 o'clock, you can kind of tickle the lip if you want, or just slightly adjust and turn underneath the lip. And then look down the line. What's the wave doing? Do we need to cut back now? Like, what is the wave slowing down? If it does, we're going to talk about that in just a second. If it's still running, now I'm going to wind up again. I'm going to aim down to the trough. And whether it's my bottom turn or that after that first sort of roller coaster top turn, whatever you want to call it, coiling up your body is really helpful. So when you go down to the bottom of the wave, compressing into the board a little bit, like you don't want to be too straight up and down with your body, too stiff. You could look at a few videos of myself or Torn or Mikey, and it'll better illustrate it than I can articulate it. I can't describe it any other way than just sort of like coiling up like a snake that's going to strike. Shortboarders do the same thing.
Right.
But it's a smoother sort of more subtle thing. It's not a pure like muscling through this aggression. And the reason is because with all of that rail, all of your turns and everything is a much wider arc. So it allows you to sort of feel more comfortable and just sort of be smooth anyways as a byproduct. Like you don't have to try to be stylish, which is a whole other part of this conversation. The
Right.
boards themselves lend the surfing to be more like smooth, because the smoother you are, the easier you'll be able to control the board easier. Remember when I was talking before about lifting the board up and tic-tacking?
Yep.
That's a really jerky motion that breaks the trim. Well, you could do the same thing off a bottom turn or a top turn if you try to lift the board where you put a lot of weight on your back foot and you're sort of lifting the front of the board up to place the board wherever you're trying to go. I would recommend avoiding doing that. Short boards are better. Like just stick to the short board.
Well, the way you described it, I love it. And I think that's one of the things that I love about, and I think this helped fix an aspect of my surfing, going from riding shortboards to going and riding mid lengths, right? Because when you're riding a shortboard, there is this tendency to just try to pump as fast as possible. You're usually in the middle of the wave. You're expending all this energy. You're throwing your arms around, and it doesn't look smooth, obviously. And what that does, though, is it trains a lot of people, including myself at that time, to just stay in the middle of the wave and think that I'm generating a lot of speed and going really fast. But really, I'm actually, it's not doing that much. And what riding the mid-length really does, and the way I would describe kind of what you had described there was, you're kind of almost doing these pumps, but these pumps are these big swooping bottom turn to high line to bottom turn to high line swoops. And I think the reason why that can be so beneficial of training yourself to do is because that's actually the way you want to get ready to do a turn. Right. And if you're just pumping in the middle of the wave and then you try and do a turn, you're not going to have enough speed. You're not going to be in the right part of the wave to do a turn. But or
out of rhythm.
Exactly. But if you're on a mid length and you're going to the bottom and going all the way to the top, and then you're reading the wave. And that's the other thing, a beautiful thing about mid length is it slows everything down so you can read the wave better. And then you'll make sections that you wouldn't normally make because you just have that natural trim speed, and you'll go around sections. And then you'll see that one section right in front of you and be like, oh, this is where I need to place that turn. And then you're high up on the wave, and then you do the turn. And I think that's where the mid length can be so beneficial, and that's why I love the way you
Yes.
described it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. You're tapping into a few things there that I was sort of seeing in my mind while you were describing your experience on shortboards. So yeah, the mid length lends itself to I don't know if it's easier pacing, but it's just a calmer pacing. You start. I think when you're on a shortboard, it's a different mentality. You're not thinking about pacing as much. I mean, maybe you are if you're a pro, but I think the average person is focused on maneuvers and quote unquote ripping and destroying the wave. So they sort of get ahead of themselves. So it's like they're not necessarily in pace with the wave because the way they're getting from point A to point B is sometimes rushed and sometimes erratic. And so while that's already happening sort of in your mind and your body, in addition, depending what your technique is, a lot of times on a shortboard, you're waving your arms a lot to get the board to move. And it looks like you're throwing pizzas and rolling up the windows. And there's all kinds of analogies there. And that can also, I believe, unless, again, pros and whatever, that's a different story. Because whoever's watching this is probably not a pro. It's like you're just like the normal person who just wants to surf better. Mid lengths, you don't, because again, you don't have to lift it up and tic tac. It's already a byproduct. It's already calming your body. And the board functions best when it's in trim. And so what do we mean by being in trim? If you're a sailor, you know what that is. If you're on a sailboat, being in trim is when everything on the boat, the sail, the mast, the moon, everything's like perfectly aligned so that the sailboat is moving through the water as efficiently as it possibly can. It's hitting its top speeds. Now, I can't do that on a sailboat if I'm turning the rudder a bunch or if I'm not following the wind line. It's the same with surfing. Like that fall line, like instead of rushing things, instead of braking and tacking back and forth, the longer I'm on that rail or the longer I'm flat on the board in a really sweet part of the wave, I'm in trim and I'm getting maximum speed. And what maximum speed does, the same as shortboarding, is it sets you up for the next maneuver. To have success on the next maneuver, you want to go into it with the most speed you can. And we didn't really get into the cutback thing, but so we kind of covered the dropping and climbing, which is that's a real basic thing. That's like that's actually what most surfers probably do. Like if you listen to Scott Bass, who has I think it's the Spit podcast, and he'll always make jokes about all I've got is a bottom turn. It's like, well, that's what most people like. If you get a bottom turn, that's kind of all you need for most people. But
I would say even a lot of people don't even have a bottom turn. A lot of people just pump in the middle of the wave, and they never even bottom turn and get into that place where they can do the top turn. And that's why I think riding a mid length and doing exactly what you're saying is the perfect way to prepare for doing turns. Like I'll see people try to do turns and they're in the middle of the wave, and I'm like, you're not going to be able to cut back. You're not even high enough on the wave to cut back, you know?
Yeah.
So
the cutback, I don't think it's that dissimilar to a shortboard. It's just that the arc is much wider, and you, with all turns in the mid length, it requires you to have patience. I just talked about rushing things. So don't get ahead of yourself. Don't try to rush, and don't try to rip and manhandle, if I may use that term, or over muscle something. It's more of a finesse kind of surfing. Not too dissimilar from longboarding you would associate with finesse and grace. And a lot of that is just the board works better when you're surfing that way. It's the same with the mid length. So let's say we do that bottom turn we just talked about. Maybe we got one or two swoops in, as you call it, which I think is a good way to describe it. Now I see, okay, the wave is definitely coming to a point where that wall has slowed down and it's getting pretty soft, or I can anticipate it's about to happen. So time that bottom turn, do not too different than the first one you did. And then as you're coming up, sort of aim for that 9 o'clock position again. And instead of dropping down and coming down the face on that 45-degree angle, which is maybe the way you started the wave, you're just going to stay committed to that rail. And it takes a lot of faith. You have to get to know your rail line and believe in the board that it will do that. If you have a good board, they should be designed to do that. So you go up into that corner pocket and just, if I'm only talking about front side surfing right now, because backside's a different thing. So front side, now I'm going to the heel side of the board and I'm leaning into the rail and I'm allowing it to, I'm just keep pushing it. And I don't try to shorten the arc. I don't try to muscle or lift the nose up, because that will break the trim. You could start sliding the fins, or you just straight fall off. And as you're doing it, it's important to understand what is your body doing? So you want to coil up again, almost like you're doing a bit of the bottom turn, but instead of leaning into your toe side, you're bending into your knees and your hips. But now we're leaning back. And one way to keep your balance and to keep your form and poise is to use your front hand. Sorry, I'm trying to get on the screen here.
Yeah.
Watch the videos of the people we already discussed, or even watch Tom Kern or Brad Gerlach or these types of surfers. You'll see that their front hand is always wherever they want to go. They keep pointing their hand, and their eyes follow. And you're not staring at your fingertips. You're gazing past your fingertips, but it's sort of like the sight of a rifle. You're looking and using this of where am I going? Yeah. And then so that is how you initiate the turn. And you have the confidence to okay, this rail line is going to hold in. I'm going to stay seated into this. I'm not going to give up on it. Just keep going. So for myself, I can bring them all the way around only if the wave has the room to do it. If it's a really cupped out tight wave, there's no way on a mid-length that you can get all of that rail and come back around and wrap up in tag the whitewater. It's just really difficult to do.
Yeah.
So if that's happening, it's a really cupped out wave. What I'll do is I will do the cutback, but instead of going 180 degrees, I will aim to the bottom of the wave, right where the whitewater is in the green face. And I head toward that and I time it so just before I get to the whitewater, I don't touch the whitewater. I go into another bottom turn, right where the lower corner is. And so imagine you're basically doing a big carve. You're carving at the top and you're coming back. You're not going up into the whitewater like a shortboard would. Yeah. Because again, it's just really hard to fit in that curve. Come down to the bottom of the wave. And just before the whitewater is going to gobble me up, I'll turn. Now, sometimes I make contact with it and maybe it's on purpose. It depends on the shape of the wave. If the wave is really mushy, it's like a super soft, I'm at Cardiff Reef at high tide or Sano or somewhere, or lowers even, high tide, I will easily go back into the whitewater because it's so flat on the face. Right, I can fit that low rocker board. But again, you're going to have to make the call. Is this a really critical wave? If it is, and I don't want to go over the handlebars, cut it a little short. That's fine. And if you do it in one fluid motion, you do that big arc, and when you come down to the bottom, just start leaning and take the exact same bottom turn form you had. And now you're potentially in your third or fourth bottom turn on the wave. Mm-hmm. And depending on what the wave's doing, either the wave's finishing and done there, or it's setting up for yet again another up and down. And there you go. Sorry, I could keep going forever.
Oh, no, this is great. How do you think about your weight distribution as you're initiating your cutback, and you're leaning into that heel side rail? Are you pretty evenly distributed front foot versus back foot? How are you thinking about your weight distribution?
It's so tough because I don't think about it, but I've had other people point out some things that I thought were interesting because I never thought about it. Somebody pointed out to me years ago, you move your back feet a lot.
You do.
I was like, I do?
Yeah.
Okay. And so I kind of paid attention to that. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. Well, why am I doing that? And it's on a shortboard, you're pretty much locked into the saddle. You're sort of, unless you're tube riding, you're not moving your feet a whole lot. your feet need to be right over the fins in most instances. It's not always the case, but most of the time. And then with the mid boards, depending on how you're kind of getting down the line, are you doing like these swooping sorts of turns? Well, for those to work really well, you do need to scooch forward just a little bit. It seems to be helpful for gaining momentum and inertia. But if I stay with my feet in that forward position and doing the turns, especially like a top check turn or a cutback, I won't be able to get the leverage needed to do a tighter arc. So you'll see my back foot moves back. Now, to answer your question, I'm shifting my weight forward and back. It's not even.
Yep.
When I'm pumping, it's a little bit more on my front foot, the way I'm going down the line. It's like a little bit more weight that way. When I go to do that cutback, you'll see my foot sometimes goes back 4 inches, maybe more. And then like initially I'm on my front foot, but as I'm coming back, as I'm turning, you can see in the video, I start leaning more on my back foot to get leverage because there's so much rail. I need to put a lot of weight on my back foot to bring it around. If I'm tube riding, which by the way, mid-lengths tube ride really well. Like it's something you think wouldn't happen, but they do.
Yeah.
And I think they do because if you look in the 70s, people were obviously riding mostly single fins and the boards were longer, but the wide point was forward. And go and check out, I think a good example is like a Wayne Lynch is a good one. If you can find it's actually kind of hard to find footage of him because he was hiding he was like drafted. The Army was trying to draft him and he was on the run. So there was like this period, there's not a lot, but there's photos of him where he's really far forward and he's got this like 7-foot rail. And so the weight distribution on that is I'm forward on the board, but I'm sort of leaning a little bit on my back sort of haunches. Mm-hmm. And the front foot doesn't have as much weight. So it's a hard one to answer. There's this dance of this back and forth, but nothing happens dramatically. It's midway through a turn, you're sort of shifting. So again, a recap is if you're a little bit forward and you're pumping and doing these swoops down the line, you're fairly even, but at certain points of the swoops, there's a little bit of weight on the front foot to kind of carry some momentum and inertia. I don't really put a lot of weight unless I'm doing wanting a tighter arc, and I'm doing that for leverage. And then for tube riding, I scoot even further forward than the swooping. You're like almost in not quite the forward third, but well up there past the halfway point.
Yeah, you just want to get as much speed as possible, and especially in a tube, right? And so getting that weight forward will help you shift. And, it's interesting that you just you keep on reemphasizing that weight shift. I just interviewed Zeke Lau yesterday or 2 days ago, and he that's what he said as well. He said surfing is all about how to shift the weight, and when to shift the weight, and those subtleties, which are obviously get very complex and depending on what part of the wave you're at and all of that. But it is interesting that you're coming to that same conclusion yourself.
Yeah.
It makes sense. It's universal, right? So
longboarding similar. Like if you maybe one day we'll do another one of these and talk about nose riding. And nose riding is interesting because as you're walking, your body naturally wants to put weight on the front at whatever foot is forward. So you're kind of like leaning forward. But while you're doing that, you have to still kind of put your hip and your butt back just a little bit so that you can keep the board in trim. And when you get up to that last step and your front foot or both feet are over the nose, there's always a little bit of a weight back. Otherwise, it's
that would have been
fall over.
I'm a complete kook when it comes to longboarding, and I took one out the other day, and that's pretty. I ate some serious crap trying to walk to the nose, like just having no idea what I was doing. So that was me.
It's tough.
We'll have to do a podcast on longboarding for sure. So let's talk about style then.
Sure.
So how do you think about style? Like, what defines style for you? And is it this conscious thing? Is it this unconscious thing? A little bit of both.
I think it's a mixture of both. Like, I think it, I think it, if you back up a little bit, we human beings, we are in love with beauty. We have been for thousands of years. There's examples everywhere. Pick any culture, and you can look to art and architecture, and that sort of tells us that we have an affinity for beauty. And when it comes to surfing, a similar thing had happened because we unfortunately we don't have documented records of how surfing started, but we all agree and know that the Hawaiians are often, they're credited as the ones who really fine-tuned and honed this activity. And you see all early imagery of them, and there's this sort of regalness to it. Now, one would say, well, that's because the boards were 100 pounds. There's really not much else they could do.
Right.
I'm like, okay, yeah, that's fair. So the form was following the function of the equipment. I think when it comes to mid-length surfing, it's sort of a similar thing. It's just obviously the boards are 100 times more maneuverable, but still the form is following the function of the equipment. And as we were saying earlier in the conversation, good style is thankfully oftentimes a byproduct of this equipment, because we've removed all those things we talked about. We don't have to, typically, you don't have to gyrate your arms to get the board to work. If you are, you're doing it wrong, because you don't need to do that. So already the arms are quieter. And so defining style to me is just making the difficult look easy. And, you could look at a bottom turn or cutback on a mid, and if you're a core shortboarder, I've heard all the jokes for most of my life that it's easy, that it's stupid, it's for kooks, it's a beginner board. But like, you are attracted to that type of surfing because of how it feels, but a lot of it's how it looks. Like you said it yourself. You saw a video and you're like, you couldn't quite put your finger on it. Why did you like it? Yeah. Was it because it's easier? I really don't think so. I don't think that's the reason you're attracted to it. I think you're attracted to it because you, like just about every human I know, likes the idea of beauty. And we don't have to get into the definition of beauty, but you know it when you see it, right? Like, and it's in the eye of the beholder. And so that type of surfing is beautiful to you. And it just so happens that a lot of other people it is. So style is often misunderstood. If you come from a performance side, mostly, if you're coming from the longboard world, you're more aligned with this thing. So it's not even worth talking about it. But if you're coming from a performance standpoint, your look at surfing is not wrong. I'm not saying any of this is wrong. It's just a different point of view. You're looking at surfing as this pursuit or endeavor where you're going to master the wave and the board, and you're going to do whatever you want to it. It's sort of like a manhandling, a domination, a tearing, a destroying. Like, it's just a different type of relationship. Style should be part of that and would make it a lot prettier to look at. I've given this example recently, but I think Ethan Ewing is a great example of high level surfing. I guess he's destroying the wave and shredding it to pieces, but he's doing it with really nice form, and it's really pleasing to watch. So I think shortboarding can be done with a hell of a lot of style, but I don't think it's the emphasis of shortboarding currently. But beauty always prevails, so I wouldn't give up on that yet. I think style's making a comeback in that world, because if you are a WSL person, you watch the scores, the Brazilian Storm has not been getting the storms they were. Now, that might be because people are just getting tired of seeing the same thing, or maybe there's a return to an appreciation of form and style. We'll see. So leave that off to the side.
Yeah.
But the style should not be contrived. It should be something. Style is an expression that comes from within. So if you are at a wedding and you look around you, and some people are just terrible dancers, and some on the dance floor when the DJ finally comes out just don't have a lot of rhythm or whatever. But a lot of people, when the music comes on, they've got like there's like a little style, there's like a little something going on there that's unique to them. And I think the surf style, You can look to other people for inspiration, and that's going to be your input, but the output is going to be what you're feeling and what you want to express. And I do think that there's a benefit to a focus on style and sort of thinking about it initially, but once you're surfing, you shouldn't be thinking about your style. It should just be a feeling. If you're thinking about your style, you're in your head too much, you're missing the point of surfing. Right. It's not, it's look, surfing is fun, and it's serious fun. Like if you're like you and I assume, or we take it seriously, but it's also fun. So we have these conversations to do all the thinking and analyzing stuff before we get in the water. And then you do that enough, it should just start happening. So your style shouldn't be contrived. It shouldn't be an act. And it should also be, it should have purpose, like what I call functional style, And remember, if we go back to the cutback example, so an easy thing to pick up on style technique without being contrived, without it feeling forced. And what I mean forced is like throwing your hands and kind of going, or just doing some weird, like,
yeah,
like, okay, look, you do you, I don't really care. But we're talking about technique. If you want to know what I think about that, I think that there's, you do you. That serves zero purpose. But surfing is about expression. If that's how you express yourself, it's not helping you surf better. If you want to surf better, good style can, and when you put it together with everything we're talking about, will help your surfing. Because when you're not rolling up the windows and gyrating and throwing your hands everywhere, you're able to sort of keep your body quiet. It's just like the sailing example. When you get everything lined up with your sail and the rudder and everything's just lined up, you don't see that person going like this on the rudder. They're not doing that. They're holding it. They pick a line. They go down that fall line. It's the same thing. And so to do that on the mid-length, the form that we're taking is going to give you great style, and you won't have to try. So go back to that front hand thing we talked about. Take your front hand. I don't think I can back up. I'm going to take off the headphones. I'm going to back up from the camera so you can see this. Yeah. Hold on. Bear with me.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Hopefully the microphone works. Okay. So front hand on the front side.
Yep.
The front hand shouldn't be up here.
Yeah.
Not up here.
Right.
It should be kind of low, sort of like near the waist level, low to down in this zone.
Mm-hmm.
And that keeps you calm. The backhand can be around here or here, down.
Yeah.
Not up here.
Yep. So Devon's keeping his hands pretty close to his waist, essentially. He's not waving them around above his head. Exactly.
Yeah. And so that stuff will throw you off balance. But the lower stuff I just showed you centers your body.
Yep.
And it, you're able to sort of like hunker down into the board, and it makes it more difficult for you to fall. It makes you less likely to wave your arms. You're usually waving your arms because you're not centered. You really are off balance, and you're trying to get that balance back.
Right.
But you keep those hands quiet and sort of bend the hips and knees a little bit and sort of sink down into the board more. It'll center you. And then as a result, you should have better style. So take that front hand, like I said, in the cutback, gaze just past your fingernails. You obviously don't want it up here because you can't do that. It should be down between sort of your waist to like mid, like rib cage zone. Mm-hmm. And so there's your bottom turn. Okay, I'm following my bottom turn. I'm going straight. Now I'm cutting back. And then the backhand, I use, and I picked this up from Tom Curran. I've never talked to him about it. I've met the guy a few times. I'm not his buddy, but I do know him.
Yeah.
And I would be way too embarrassed to say like, hey, I noticed this thing you do with your hand. I picked up from him and couple other surfers that are really good. They use the backhand as like a way to feel the distance to the wave. So if you're in a tube, all good tube riders have their hand right here, and they're not really touching the wave. Tube riding, automatically gives you good style if you're doing it right. Because if you're bent over at the hips and looking down, it's going to look terrible and you're going to eat shit.
Right.
If you've sat down, bent your knees, and your butt is approaching, touching the back of your calves and heels, you're down low. This position gives you a lot of stability to not lean into the wave or fall forward. It also happens to look good. It's the same thing with most things in mid-lengths. If you just sort of relax your hands, and don't have them be stiff. They shouldn't be really stiff. They should be like loosely like this, and just
right,
kind of loose. When you're doing a bottom turn, that hand could be either touching the water or near it, but find like a really good bottom turn of Brad Gerlach or Donovan Frankenreiter or those types of guys, or anybody in the 70s on those, like Terry Fitzgerald and those types of surfers. Even Kelly Slater and the top guys, if you get a still photo of them bottom turning, their hand is just sort of there, and it's a way to feel things out. Now, most mid-length maneuvers, you're fairly upright, but following that same hand technique can help you. When there's no wave face near you, you don't need to have your hand up like you're touching the wave face, because that doesn't do anything. Yeah. At that point, you drop your hand. But bringing the hands sort of as a steering wheel, and as like, if you're doing the high wire act, there's certain things you do with your arms for balance. And I think if you look at February, Torrin Martin, maybe some of the videos of myself, just look at what those hands are doing and how it relates to the body positioning and the shifting of that weight. And I think it was a long answer to style, but it's just a difficult subject to talk about, because style a lot of times is just like, it when you see it. Art and beauty, it when you see it. And it's hard to sort of drill down into exactly what it is, but it's form is following the function. And then we end up enjoying seeing this kind of surfing because we always, a default of human nature is to value beauty.
Yeah. I think that's such an interesting way of thinking about it. When you talk about it, what it makes me think about is, because there's this beauty and economy of movement and simplicity of movement, combined with it being functional. And I think of a bullfighter.
Right.
You could have two bullfighters. Really, at the end of the day, you're just trying not to get killed by the bull. But there could be one bullfighter that just barely shifts his body and slips past that horn, just going an inch past his chest and nearly dying, but not dying, and being in complete control. And that obviously is the most beautiful style. And then there could be the guy that runs and jumps a foot out of the way, and he's just waving his arms around. He's desperate to get out. I mean, they got the same outcome. They're both, they both avoided the bull. But obviously, which bullfighter do you respect more? It's the one that just did the bare amount minimum in order to achieve its objective. And the way you were talking about it made me think about that.
You just described a matador versus a rodeo clown.
Yeah, sorry, I meant a matador, but I meant a matador.
No, I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
Right.
So a matador, there's a lot of tradition there.
Right.
And I'm sorry to any of the vegans or whatever. I'm not going to get into the animal rights stuff, but that is the technique there,
right?
And the poise, is incredible. And just a quick aside on that, there is a photo from the early 60s of a really well-known surfer, Joey Cabell, who was largely considered the best surfer in the world in the sort of early to late 60s. And he's in Peru for the world contest, and you can find this photo easily. I don't know if Leroy Granis took it. I can't quite remember. And here's this fantastic surfer who's well-known and regarded for his big wave prowess on the North Shore. And he's just calmly doing the matador thing, and he has a Hawaiian print shirt on. He might even be barefoot and with like high water jeans, like a surfer of the day. And so surfers in the 50s and 60s were measured. Good surfing was measured by style. And it wasn't until some years later where the focus shifted, when the focus was a bit more competitive and maneuver-driven surfing, sort of in the peak of that, I'd say, is in the 80s. It shifted the focus, because that's with the media, magazines, they were following what the brands were interested in, and, the Quicksilvers, Rip Curls, and whatnot. They were putting a lot of their resources in competitive surfing. Like, hey, look, this is the high bar. This is where the top performance is happening. And those folks were being judged and rewarded for a lot of maneuvers. And over time, style just sort of fell out of favor. When you look at the whole picture of surfing, we've had way more years of style being important than not. So it was only just this kind of 2-3 decade period where the mainstream focus was more maneuver driven and less on style. And as I said earlier, I feel like there's a return to style. This mid-length sort of boom, if that's what you want to call it, I think that speaks to it. That's one of the main attractions to it. And I think even in the shortboard world, you're seeing an appreciation of, I guess you'd call it traditional shortboarding, if that's even a thing, which is not just a focus on acrobatic maneuvers, but on the fundamental principles of really good foundational surfing, which is your bottom turn, top turn combos and cutbacks.
Yeah. No, I think there is a little bit of this resurgence. I don't remember which channel it was, but literally they're having a contest like who's doing the best roundhouse cutback. And they're just finding old clips of like Aki and Curran and all these guys, and they're just doing these perfect cutbacks that, and they're going right off the lip, and just so smooth. And I think that how that thing's blowing up is just a testament to how people are just like, they want to go back to the surfing, a certain kind of surfing, this traditional shortboarding, whatever you want to call it. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a cutback, you're not doing a air reverse or whatever, but that's what people like to watch, so
yes,
it is interesting. Well, I know we got to dive into, we've been talking a lot, going for a while about technique and style. We still need to get into, mid-length design. So I just want to check in here. So pause recording for a second, because we are coming up on the hour. I just want to make sure you don't have like another whatever.
I have somebody coming at 12:30. It's fine.
Okay.
Go as long as you feel like it.
Okay. Well, let's just dive into this. All right. But note to editor, cut at about an hour. We're gonna have to cut this out.
Okay.
Okay. Cool. So let's get into picking the right mid length or egg or whatever. I guess let's call it a mid length, right? Because there are going to be a couple boards that we're going to be talking about in this section here. How do you think about choosing between and picking the right board to suit your style and conditions and whatnot? I know that's a broad question, and we can start wherever you want, but how do you think about it?
There's just like all things in surfing, there's just sort of guidelines. There's no rules. Surfing is very personal when it comes to boards and fins. But that said, I've found it a helpful guide when people ask me the same question, like, hey, I want to get my first mid-length. What size do I get? And I base this largely off the boards I've ridden, which are the egg arenas. The most recent example would be the CI Mid. So if you're on this channel watching us, you've probably come across the CI Mid at some point. I'd say it's sort of like a pulled in speed egg kind of thing, but I think it's largely, that shape is now largely recognized as like the mid length. And then from that, you have other shapes like fishes, and then you have different fin configurations. So if we're just talking like the straight up CI Mid style of board, I usually will say, if you're a really good surfer and you're coming from a shortboard background primarily, if you're sort of in the 8-inch above your height is a good starting place. If you're good and you're comfortable and you come from a shortboard background. If you're good and comfortable and come from a longboard background and you're sizing down, you're probably in the 12-inch range because you're used to all this board. And to go to the same as the shortboard, I just feel like it's too big of a jump. You're going to feel really under volumed. If you're sort of in between all that, let's say you're intermediate, you're pretty good. You're not more than intermediate. What's above intermediate? I mean, whatever that level is above intermediate, like around 10 inches of your height. So that's just kind of like a guideline. And that's for most of your common body types. they're going to be looking at the thickness. Like most of the board folks that shape your board, they kind of know what to do on thickness. But if you're going to a surf shop and buying one off a rack, um, use me as a reference. I'm a little bit above the average body type, so I'm 6'1", 200 pounds. Unfortunately, used to be 180, 185, but we won't get into that. I ride. My favorite size is 6'11", 21 1/8 wide, and 2 13/16 or 2 7/8 thick. I don't recommend getting boards too thick with mid lengths, and the reason is that, remember, we talked about this is long rail surfing. Now imagine if you have this big fat rail down the whole thing. Have you ever tried to bottom turn or turn a wave storm or Jerry Lopez? I hope the answer is no, but if you have, if you have, those are giant rails, and they're really challenging. So a lot of the surfing done on those is done like on a real flat kind of type of turns. It's hard to sink a rail, and all the way back to the very best boards in the 70s, they would get them really knifey. Like we call it foiled. It's when there's the shape of the rail, and the skinnier and the lower it gets, your center thickness will dictate that. However, depending on who shapes your board, some of the boards have a flat deck and some of them have a crown deck. And you just sort of need to be aware that you can't just like look at a board just on a website only. A lot of times it's good to go to a surf shop if you can and put the board you're looking at under your arm and feel it in the palm of your hand. Like you can feel the thickness of a board. So that usually these fingers are touching the bottom of the board.
Yep.
And then the board is like cupped down in here, and with your palm, you sort of feel right where your palm is. And it's like, does that feel thick to you? If it does, it might be a little bit hard to sink the rail on a bottom turn. So there's a little bit of trial and error with thickness, but most mid lengths available out there come in stock standard size, width and thickness based off of the length. So again, if we go back to the guide, you're a short board. Most boards out there, you're in a safe zone around 8 inches over your height. You're sort of like intermediate to above to like, proficient, 10 inches. If you're a longboarder that's really good, 12 inches. If you're intermediate or below and kind of terrible, maybe 16 inches over your height, just to have that extra stability. Now, the danger is going too big or too small. So let's talk about too small real quick. If you go too small, you are now, in effect, you're sort of changing the way that the design works. There's a diminishing point of returns. If you go too short, you are now losing the surface area that provides all the glide that we've been talking about, and the trim, and your ability to not have to pump the board. If the board gets short enough or too short to make it go, you're forced to pump the board. Now you're in a different category almost.
Yeah.
If you're pumping the board because it's too short and it won't trim, you might just stick with a short board. I mean, just my advice. You can do whatever you want. It's a free world. But short boards are meant to be pumped, mid lengths are not. So I wouldn't really go below, for anybody of any ability. I typically would dissuade you from going under 8 inches over your height. That seems to be a pretty good guideline. Mm-hmm. And then too big, it's just an obvious one. Like too big, the board gets unwieldy, and you're not really going to effectively do the swoops and turns you want because it's just too much board. So you'll see people like, hey, I just want to ride an 8-foot mid length. Hey, dude, no problem. Totally cool. And then, well, why can't I do like the turns you're doing? And it's like, well, it's just the math equation. It doesn't really work because you have a foot more rail than most people do. So now you're trying to fit all that rail. Now, if you're a high-level surfer, you're a Taylor Jensen 3-time world champion longboarder, sure, you can rip that 8-footer. Harley Ingleby, Joel Tudor, anybody, they can ride 8-footers. But if you want to be able to get the most out of your turns, I would caution going too big. You can go to the 8-foot range so long as you're comfortable with that more like straight ahead kind of drop and climb. And you're an older dude or gal, you're 70s, and you're just like, hey, I just need to pop to my feet and get out to the shoulder. no worries. Go even 8'6", 8 foot, whatever. But as long as you set your expectation of what kind of surfing you want to be able to do,
Yeah.
if you keep in the guideline that I provided here, you really can't miss with that.
Yeah, and I think the 8 foot size is going to be good for more of a developing surfer as well, right? I think you're talking about a
Yeah,
surfer that's already fairly proficient, and that would be the
yeah,
optimal where you're okay. I'm trying to work on my turns, but if you're getting off a soft top or something like that, and you're trying to get a little bit more performancy, then you're probably going to want to go on the bigger side, right? So that's where
yeah,
you'd go bigger. Okay.
yeah. And I real quick, one more quick thing
Yeah.
on just my own experience of riding big ones. They paddle well. The waves are pumping and big. There's a great paddle advantage. What I didn't like was now that I've blown everything up, it's gotten thicker. Sometimes the stringer's thicker. I didn't like the flex pattern. So that's one thing we didn't even get into at all, but
Mm.
very quickly. Part of the design and the reason that you want the rails thin is, yes, for getting that rail in the water, but as you're going through the turn, you want the board to twist through and bend. If you get a board that's too thick, or it's made out of like a really crazy composite material, like a firewire or any of your carbon techs that are out there, pick any one. Um, Unless it's like a carbonized resin, like Channel Islands has a eco carbon tech. There's no like carbon wrap in it. There's a recycled ground up powder in the resin, so it doesn't make the board too stiff. Most carbon boards for mid lengths, I would stay away from. Not a fan at all, unless you like going straight. You need the rail to be thin, and you need the board to be able to flex and twist because it's so much board
Mm.
to be able to get that extra bit of performance. And even a high level shortboarders will tell you they want to feel some flex in their board, and it's a part of surfing that I don't think we talk enough about. But flex in the board, a little bit of flex in the fins, but not too much. You don't want like a mushy plastic fin. Um, which got me to think maybe we should talk about fin setups because that's another
Yeah.
thing. Should I go single fin, twin fin?
Yeah, that's
I,
definitely a good topic. But I just want to point out it's interesting. I've never thought about flex on a long like a mid length before. I mean, I definitely think about it on short boards, but that is interesting and it makes sense, obviously. So, how do you think about picking the right fin setup for?
yeah, it's always a good one, and I'd imagine some people can take issue with any of this. It's just my own experience. So, because of the way I grew up surfing, the three fins was a big part of my life. In the 80s and 90s, the longboards I was riding, most of them had three fins. Donald Takayama called it a 2+1 setup. Although I did get a note from Matt Biolis a year or two ago that that's completely false. A 2+1 should be a twin plus a trailer. The 2+1s I'm referring to are a big center fin and a small side fin. He's saying that's 1+2, whatever. So as long as we know we're talking about big center fin, little side bites.
Yeah.
I really love that, and what I feel that setup is ideal for probably the majority of surfers, and the reason being is it's reliable, it's versatile. There's no big surprises with it. And so it's like taking sort of a three fin, a twin fin, and a single fin, and you're getting the best of all of them. And when you're going sort of straight down the line or up the face and kind of cruising, there's a bit of a freedom feel that you get out of a single fin. When you go to engage off a bottom turn or a cutback, there's a squirt and drive and hold and grip that you don't always get with single fins. There are a few shapers out there that do some trick stuff, like they put a lot of channels in the board. That helps a lot.
Mm-hmm.
They're just compensating for the lack of the fin. So if you're going to do the single fin thing, having some other stuff going on the bottom can be helpful. Single fins, I think, on a mid-length really stand out in the following conditions. Tube riding, because there's no drag. It's extremely free and fast. So if you're just sort of focused on the tubes, a single fin can be amazing. If you don't require a really serious heavy bottom turn to set it up, if you're just paddling in, angling, and getting blown out of a barrel like East Coast style, single fins are sick, I think. The other thing that a single fin I think is great for is small, terrible waves. And the reason being is we have all this rail we've talked about numerous times. And When you have the side bites on, you cannot do as tight of a turning radius. When you have a single fin, you can pivot. So imagine I'm at a little crappy like day anywhere, any beach break in the world. It's waist to stomach high, nipple high, gutless, but I need to do a quick direction change. When I have those side bites and the 2+1 setup, it's really tough. It feels kind of stiff and it doesn't respond well. And I can't do a quick direction change. When I have a single fin, especially if the fin's a little bit smaller, now I can do those direction changes. So if I pick a 2+1, I like that. Probably most bang for your buck if you got to pick one board, because you can ride the 2+1. The waves are good. It's shoulder high, it's head high. There's plenty of room on the face. You need room on the face to move that board around. Oh, I show up a couple days later, it's garbage. Guess what? Pull all of the fins out and put a single fin in. Mm-hmm. You're not going to be able to just use the center fin you have usually unless you've overfinned your board and it's huge. A lot of times, if you're around a 7-foot mid, you're looking at an 8-inch fin, usually, depending on the template, 8.5 perhaps. When you're doing the 2+1, sorry, this is a bit of a plug, but just look at the CI mid fin set, find whatever competitor version of that. That's what you're looking for. It's usually a 6.5-inch center fin. My friend Wayne Rich makes one with True Aims. It's sick. I used to use that for years. But you want to find a center fin that's 6.5, 7 at the most. And then the side bites, depending on your weight. I ride a 4-inch side bite. Again, I weigh 200 pounds. If you're, let's say you're like 170, let's say 160 and under, maybe go with a 3.5 or 3.6. And all the brands make kind of a 3.5 and a 4, or a 3.7 and a 4. General rules there, 160, 170 max. Go with the smaller side fin. You're over that with the bigger one. If you're over that and you weigh 180, 200 pounds and you like a really loose board, go with the small side bites, but spread out the cluster. Don't keep the cluster too close together. I could go on in lots of details on that. I guess the last thing on 2+1, and we'll move on. When you go to set up your fins, most of the fin setups by most board builders, you're going to put in the side bites, and then where the trailing tips of those fins are, draw an imaginary line, and where the trailing base is, draw an imaginary line. And it's usually, depending on how much rake you have, you're talking about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch space. The front leading edge or at the base of your center fin should line up somewhere in that plane. So you usually run the cluster pretty close together. If the cluster of your 2+1 is really spread out, I'm pretty sure your board's going to feel quite stiff.
Right.
And I've run into a lot of that in the water. People are like, I'm not really loving this. And I look and the fin is way too far back. My recommendation is to start with the fin. At the very least, the center fin is lined up with the trailing tips of your side fins. That's a great starting point. One more thing. I don't have any financial affiliation with these people, but there's a little thing called a fin jack that I've enjoyed. It's a little piece of plastic that allows you to move the fin while you're surfing. FCS also has a system. Again, I'm not associated with FCS. FCS also has a system where you can pop the fin in and out. Very helpful when you're learning what fin placement on a mid-length, because the fin can make such a huge difference. I know people have heard this a million times, but I think it's the area that almost all of us put the least amount of thought and time into.
Yeah.
And it can make or break your board. So get a center fin, whether it's 2+1 or 1+2, whatever you want to call it, and a single fin. And after each wave, if the board's too stiff, bump the fin 1/8 to 1/4 inch forward in the water, put it back in, catch the next wave. If it's still not enough, keep moving it. And conversely, the opposite. If your fin's too far forward, the board's too squirrely, you're not getting enough drive, bump it back. And I can feel an 1/8 inch increment because you're shifting that whole area, that fin forward or back 1/8 of an inch. It makes a huge difference.
Wow. Yeah. So when do you ride twins?
So twins, I was never a twin fin person. Like I said, I just was very comfortable with 3 fin. A few years ago, I did a twin fin, and what I liked about it, and when I jump on one, is when the waves are really fast, and I'm really focused on top end speed. They're a little bit faster than the 2+1. Somebody who knows more about hydrodynamics could probably explain it. I'm just telling you what I feel. It's faster, and everyone who's ridden twins likes twins because there's a skatier, quicker down the line feel. Mm-hmm. When the waves are really facey and mushy, I like it, but I don't love it as much as a 2+1. So I'll do the 2+1 if the waves are kind of bigger and facier and mushier. If it's really kind of fast, I'm at a point break, or it's sort of tubing, I love how fast the twin goes. And then there's also there's quads, which I've spent no time on. I've had feedback though on quads, which is they're in a similar way that they're really fast down the line. They seem to go up the face of the wave quicker and easier. Like if you're looking up at the top, the arc of the twin fin is sometimes a little bit wider, and you get up the face quicker with the quads or even a twinser, which I've only dabbled with a little bit. But twinser is sort of in the realm of the twin fin. So I think just think of what kind of feeling do you want as a recap. Go the single fin if you're like a cruisy kind of person. You're not trying to do really hard turns at top speed. You're just looking for an easy, friction-free feeling on the face or in the tube. Mm-hmm. Or you're oftentimes surfing really crappy waves. Like in Japan, for example, they really love single fins because the waves are like knee-high. And you're able to kind of go 10 or 15 feet, it closes out, and you need to be able to change direction really quickly. I feel single fins are really good for that. I'll go to the twin fin when I'm only really focused on top end speed. I still like the turns. I just think the turns are a little more buttery when I jump on my 2+1. Mm. The 2+1, I'm a bit biased because that's what I am comfortable with from what I grew up in doing.
Right, you know? Right.
Feedback overall on boards we've built here at Channel Islands, an overwhelming amount of people loved the 2+1. They ended up getting the twin fin later, and they're riding the twin fin more. And I think it's because of the gas pedal. You just lean into the board a little bit, it just takes off. Yeah. And it's, again, you're not going vertical or doing airs. You're going to take the speed over the like best turn of your life, you know? So I think it's going to come down to a feeling. And I hope those descriptions help people maybe sort of like decipher what feeling are you after. I don't think there's a one board that solves it all. If you had to only pick one, then you just take that thing I ran through and go,
which one?
That's me.
Yeah. Well, you also, you guys also have the triplane hull, and you guys also have the M23. Where do those kind of slot in? When do you ride those guys?
Oh yeah. Yeah. The M23 is, it's more of a hybrid. So we don't have to get too technical with naming because surfing shouldn't have all these supposed rules. I'm not super into the dogma, but if we want to get technical, the M23 is more what we call a hybrid. And so it comes more from the sort of 90s, like the fun board era. So Al Merrick, he was getting older. He was in his 40s or 50s, and he started riding a board that looks very similar to this M23. It eventually became a model called the M13, very popular, especially in this area, in the 805, Santa Barbara, Ventura, Oxnard. And then it's been updated slightly. So it's got more rocker in it, and it has a thruster setup, and it has more of a classic shortboard bottom. It's also a double barrel like the mid. So there's some similarities to the bottom, I guess, but it has more rocker. So I think if let's say you're a shortboarder and you just, for the life of you, you cannot do the mid, whatever the reason is.
Yeah.
You don't want to be some, the hipster poser person or whatever the critiques are. And you have a really strong foundation in shortboarding. I think the M23 or any brand that makes a hybrid, that's probably a good first step because now you can get used to more volume.
Yeah.
And you still can feel like you're performing. it's a big jump to go from a shortboard to a lot of the mids because it's a giant shift in rocker. So
Yeah.
your timing and your turns, everything is different. You're sort of relearning surfing in some ways. And if that doesn't sound like something you want to do, that's not exciting. Seek out the hybrids. I like the M23. It's really fun. Like I ride a 6'8" or a 6'10". I'm sort of in that range. I'll go down even a little shorter
Yeah.
than the mid length because I'm I'm not moving on the board as much. My foot's planted a little bit more. I still move my foot a little bit, but I'm more on the tail on that one. And there's a video or two you might be able to find out there, and you can see the difference in the turns.
Yeah, I remember watching it earlier, and you're definitely drawing different lines. You're definitely getting more vertical and being a little
Yeah,
more aggressive on it. So it is
yeah,
interesting seeing the difference.
yeah.
And I'm curious, what do you, when it's barreling, would you rather
Mhm.
take more rocker, or do you want to get in earlier with the CI mid? Like, which one do you prefer?
Um, that's a great question. I think it has to do with what kind of barrel waves you're in. So, um, the waves I tend to end up at just because they're either like home breaks or just in this area. The Southern California waves, with the exception of a few, you can kind of roll into them. So if you're rolling in and you're not airdropping, just like tail tap, like a Dane Reynolds or Andy Aarons drop, which I would never want to do in my life. um, Looks fun, but I'd probably do the splits and pull a hammy. Um, I think that the lower rocker, I'm totally fine with it because um, I'm not, the wave is so big that there's plenty of room. If it's a small dumping pitching barrel and it's like I'm trying to squeeze into like a New Jersey, like
Yeah.
shoulder high or a foot or two overhead, a little bit of rocker is not a bad idea. So like an M23 is pretty nice for that. But we have a lot of people that ride these boards on the East Coast and they're having zero trouble getting into the wave and getting to their feet. And then they just pick their line. And a way to successfully tube ride really on any board is to take off behind the section.
Yeah.
It's a common theme in surfing. You just want to be deeper than you think. And so if you can, especially on A-frames, if you can sort of, let's say you want to go right, you want to be a little bit more on like where you almost look like you want to go left, but now you want to backdoor that peak and vice versa if you're going to go left. And by getting to your feet early, angling on a 45-degree, um, at least our boards have plenty of rocker. I'm not hearing or seeing issues of people going over the handlebars. Unless the only times I've had trouble is in like really big Hawaii. I
Mm.
remember surfing a day that was pretty massive at Haleiwa, and that was just silly. I shouldn't like. I'd say most of these mids max out at double overhead, and that double overhead it's really helpful if the waves are clean. If you have 1 foot chops coming at you, it's a devil wind. You're at J Bay. The nature of those boards, it's just not really conducive to a bunch of chops coming over the bow. They're primarily designed for sort of their like California glassy conditions. So the same thing would apply to the East Coast, a clean day, preferably offshore or very low wind. So I don't think the rocker's an issue,
Yeah.
but you do have to get used to it. And don't take late drops and don't paddle straight to the beach. Always paddle on an angle.
Yeah. Totally. And then what about the triplane hole? When does that come out?
So I ride that when I just want a different feeling, or if I am riding a really small beach break. It's the same example I gave earlier. I just sometimes the twin like there's not enough space for me to get up to speed to really get all I can out of the board, and I can get the same trim and paddling and all that out of the triplane hole. But when it's like knee to waist high, and then I can turn. I have ridden the triplane hole in bigger waves. I rode it in overhead Hawaii. It was like a foot or two overhead, but it was clean, and I thought it was pretty sick. It was maybe a little too much on top of the water. The board's bottom design, the benefit of it for smaller waves is it gets you up on top of the water and going fast, quickly. Um, Downside of that when it's a little bigger is you're a little too much on top of the water,
Mm.
and sometimes the grip of the board for having just a single fin wasn't enough for me. I'm a bit heavy footed, But I've had other people write and say, "Hey, I wrote it a couple feet overhead. It was so sick." And some people have the exact opposite view of me and said, "I actually don't like the triplane hole in small waves. I like it when it's bigger." And I'm just
Oh,
like, so it just
so
it,
subjective.
it really is. And I think boards are subjective. I think fins and fin setups are even more subjective than the boards themselves. Um, so that's kind of for me, and I ride them all. I surf a lot of point breaks. I surf a lot of Rincon and Malibu, Cardiff Reef, and Swamis, those sorts of waves, and all of the boards work. It's sort of like horses for courses. It's like, okay, what's going on? And it's easy to fall into surfing the same board over and over. I'm lucky. I have access to quite a few boards. I get it. I'm totally spoiled. I admit it. In a perfect world, every surfer has 3 surfboards. And I would recommend that those 3 boards all provide a different feeling. You will never get bored. You will always be challenged. And when you get to a point where you're not excited and you're not pulling out that surfboard anymore, my recommendation is sell it, move it on to somebody else, roll that money over, and get a new board, but get one that doesn't duplicate what you have already. Try to challenge yourself. I think a short board, a mid, and a long board is a good way to go.
Interesting. I like that. All right, we got to work towards closing up, but I got 3 more quick questions for you.
Sure.
When you catch a wave, what is your intention? What's going through your head?
Well, most of the places I surf, there's a lot of people in the way. So I'm like, am I going to kill anyone? That's the first thing.
I saw that one wave at Malibu where there's like a guy, drops in on you and there's another guy behind you who runs over another dude. Like it was complete mayhem. It looked insane.
Yeah, it's psycho. Well, there's the whole like, what's the crowd doing? But let's just remove the crowd. If that's not part of the equation, is positioning and catching a wave is like a hunt to me. I really enjoy it. I enjoy having watched decades of patterns of the way water moves and especially the relationship to the reef, and looking in and triangulating my position. I love that idea, the challenge and the sort of reward of putting yourself in the right place at the right time. That keeps me extremely interested in surfing for some reason. And what I'm trying to do is I want to put myself in as critical, as deep of a moment as I can so that I can push the board to its limits. And there's something thrilling about being on the edge of a disaster. It's like a tightrope act, which sounds hyperbolic. I know it's a mid-length, it's a fun board. They're just going straight and it's boring and those boards suck. But once you get into it, they're not easy. If you want to achieve surfing at the level of a February or Torn or somebody, Joel Tudor, name insert surfer, but putting the board on rail and bearing as much rail, that's sort of what's going through my mind is, am I putting myself in the best spot to do a bottom turn that's going to get me to that section over here without any hiccups, without bogging, without waving my arms around, throwing pizzas because I was off balance. That's sort of what's going through my head. And if possible, I really do like tube riding. It's just there's not a lot of it here in Southern California.
I love that analogy. And, what you're describing there, just putting yourself in the most critical position. I remember seeing Conor O'Leary. He posted a clip on a CI mid, and it was just the craziest cutback. And it was this massive swooping thing, and he went like vertical to hit the whitewash rebound. And he was like, that was one of the best feelings I've ever had on a surfboard. And he was like on a 6.8 or something like that. And he's normally riding little potato chips, I think
that's a great example.
Yeah. I think there is this kind of, there's this beauty to like doing a really proper good turn on a big board, because it's not easy. There's this mastery element to it that is inspiring when you see somebody do it. All right, second question: if you had to surf one wave for the rest of your life, what would it be?
That was such a tough one, but I would say Jeffreys Bay.
All right, J-Bay. In spite of the sharks.
I've spent a month in J Bay, and it was 25 years ago, and I think about that place every day. And sharks are real. We just lost an amazing surfer the other
Yeah.
day, Tamayo Perry, who's one of the
Yeah.
most incredible surfers ever. And I don't know what the answer is to the shark thing. I mean, um, I overheard a quote from someone that was quoting Tamayo Perry. I just overheard it in the water the other day. I was at Lowers, and if this quote is accurate, and it was something like, Tamayo said to someone like, "Why do you think you're so special that the shark's going to pick you?"
Hmm.
And it's just we don't know why the shark picks you.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things we just don't like to talk about. But you aren't going to stop surfing, and I'm not going to stop surfing.
Yeah.
And the only thing I can offer to avoid sharks is don't eat them. That's all I got for you. Don't eat the sharks.
All right. Wise words. All right. If you had to ride one board for the rest of your life, what would it be?
100%, it would be a mid-length. It would be, oh man, it would be really difficult to choose between I'm looking at them, a 2+1 or a twin.
Okay.
Gosh. Maybe here, the answer is it would be 6'11" mid, maybe a 7.0.
Yeah.
2 7/8, 2 13/16, 21 1/8, 6'4" or 6'4" deck, 6 bottom, sanded gloss. I'd probably put a leash on it because sometimes I don't like leashes, but when there's rocks or there's a crowd, you should wear one. I know. And then, gosh, I would put a fin setup where it could be a twin and a 2+1, which is kind of hard to do.
Yeah. Can you do that? I mean, or are the bottom concaves not going to work for the twin? Because usually isn't there, it's like instead of a concave, it's like this V. Like, does that work?
Yeah.
Or
The bottom is not the issue. It's just getting the most out of the fins. The 1+2, 2+1, the fins are a bit more forward, and they can be, when you go to do it as a twin, it just doesn't have as much drive, and it's a little loosey goosey.
Got it.
It can be done. I just haven't. I'd have to probably do 3 or 4 or 5 boards, burn through it, figure it out. Maybe that's what I'll do.
That'd be a pretty versatile setup. I could see people getting into that. Yeah.
Yes.
All right, Devon. Well, thank you so much. It was an incredible pleasure. We went way longer than expected, but this was awesome. It was full of gold, and we'll have to have you back on.
Yeah, anytime. And thanks for whoever's listening for hanging in there this long. And we could talk about longboarding sometime. There's a whole lot to go into there if you ever want to get into it.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Devon.
Okay, thank you.